Donald Trump wants the public to believe Washington is becoming safer under his leadership, but his own remarks blur a White House ballroom project, military infrastructure, drones, bomb shelters, campaign donors, and presidential power into one extraordinary package. That matters because the White House is public property. National security is public business, and decisions involving either are supposed to operate under rules larger than one president's preferences. So the question here is simple. Where does a presidential construction project end, and where does government power begin? The immediate scene is unusual enough on its own. Trump walks reporters around the White House grounds discussing a ballroom project. But then the description changes. He says the project has become, in his words, so much a military component, involving drones, a drone proof roof, bomb shelters, and a military complex. He says drones positioned there would protect Washington and the White House. That is not a minor architectural detail. A ballroom is one thing. A hardened facility with an operational national security function is something else. And once the president himself describes the project in military terms, the public deserves clarity about who designed that component, who authorized it, who pays for it, which agency controls it, and what legal process governs it. Now, the source material does not give us independent documentation establishing exactly what this proposed drone infrastructure consists of. We do not have engineering plans, procurement documents, military specifications, or an agency statement explaining the system. That distinction is important. What we have is Trump publicly describing the project this way, and that creates the first major contradiction. Trump presents the ballroom as an extraordinary personal achievement, repeatedly emphasizing its appearance, its materials, its superiority to other ballrooms, and the experience guests will have there. Yet, in practically the same breath, he presents it as part of a military security architecture protecting the capital. Those two functions are not necessarily incompatible. A government building can have ceremonial and security purposes simultaneously, but combining them increases the need for oversight. It does not decrease it. If another president announced that a signature construction project on White House grounds would also become a drone facility and military complex, would you accept "trust me" as sufficient explanation? That is the standard worth applying regardless of the president's name. Then the conversation gets stranger. Trump starts discussing the stone being used in the project. He says it has what he calls a million-year life, describing it as extremely strong and comparing its strength with concrete. Whether that description is technically meaningful in the way he presents it is not established by the source material. But notice what is happening politically. The president is personally selling the quality and grandeur of a project whose legal authority is simultaneously being challenged. And then he shifts to the White House lawn. Trump says Scott's Miracle-Gro provided grass free of charge. More importantly, he openly connects the company to his campaign, saying it contributed to him, before praising the company and its owners. Again, we need to be precise. The source material does not establish an illegal quid pro quo. It does not establish that free landscaping was exchanged for political favors. It does not provide campaign finance records, ethics findings, contracts, invoices, or testimony proving misconduct. But that does not make the disclosure meaningless. The president himself publicly connected three facts. A company supported his campaign, the company provided something to the White House free of charge, and he then praised that company while speaking as president on White House grounds. That is exactly the kind of situation where transparency matters because public office and political relationships are occupying the same frame. The relevant question is not whether grass is important. It is whether the public has a right to know the rules governing private benefits supplied to presidential property or government grounds by political supporters. And there is a larger pattern emerging here. Personal enthusiasm, public property, campaign relationships, ceremonial construction, and national security are being discussed as though the boundaries between them barely matter. Those boundaries matter enormously because the presidency is not ownership. A president occupies the White House. A president exercises enormous authority, but the building, the grounds, the military, and the institutions surrounding that office do not become private extensions of the person holding it. And that brings us to the legal fight described in the material. According to the source, Trump is facing litigation over the Ballroom project and was asked what he would do if the Supreme Court ruled against him. Trump responded that he could not imagine that happening and attacked the plaintiffs standing. He characterized the challenge as essentially coming from someone unhappy with the view while walking nearby. But the source itself offers a very different description of the legal theory that a preservation organization is challenging alterations involving historic public property and that the dispute involves congressional authority. We should be careful here because the supplied material does not include the actual complaint, appellate opinion, Supreme Court filing, or full judicial record. So we cannot responsibly treat the commentator's legal interpretation as a substitute for those documents. What we can say is that Trump's own response focuses heavily on standing rather than directly answering the broader institutional question: what authorization is required for a president to transform part of the White House complex through a project that he himself says contains a military component? That is where this stops being a story about architecture. It becomes a story about constraints on executive power. And this is exactly how political narratives become dangerous to your own credibility. One side gives you a dramatic interpretation, the politician gives you another, and repeating either one without separating the documented fact from the commentary leaves your argument exposed. Strong political convictions deserve evidence strong enough to defend them. Don't Get Played gives you a practical method for making that distinction. The complete digital ebook is only $9 one time. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. Because the legal dispute is only one part of the contradiction. While Trump is discussing construction, grass, drones, and the ballroom, reporters turn to Iran. His answer is remarkable for a different reason. Asked about reopening negotiations, Trump says maybe at some point, but describes the current situation as so good. He then repeats his position that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That policy position is clear enough. The contradiction lies in the description of conditions. Trump also claims the United States has complete control of the Strait of Hormuz. He acknowledges what he calls occasional nuisance drone activity, but describes the waterway as effectively under control, with ships moving through and oil continuing to flow. The source material challenges that claim aggressively, alleging continuing attacks on tankers and severe disruption. But once again, the responsible way to handle this is not to inherit the source commentator's certainty. The material does not provide shipping data, military reports, insurance rates, vessel tracking records, casualty reports, or independent evidence sufficient to establish the precise operational status of the strait. So we are left with something narrower, but still important. The president is making an extremely strong claim: complete control. That phrase carries a high evidentiary burden. If hostile forces can meaningfully threaten commercial shipping, if traffic is materially disrupted, or if insurers and shipping companies still treat passage as dangerous, then complete control would be difficult to reconcile with the practical reality. If, on the other hand, traffic is moving at broadly normal levels under effective protection, Trump's characterization would have substantially more support. That is the evidence we would need. And notes the difference between analysis and propaganda. Propaganda tells you which conclusion to adopt before showing you the measuring stick. Analysis tells you what would prove or disprove the claim. The same discipline applies to oil. Trump argues that abundant American production, including supplies from Texas, Alaska, and Louisiana, has helped prevent oil from reaching catastrophic levels. The source commentator responds by pointing to high fuel prices and argues that if supply were truly abundant, prices should simply fall. But global oil markets are more complicated than that. Prices are influenced not merely by American production, but by global demand, transportation risk, refining capacity, crude grades, inventories, geopolitical uncertainty, and expectations about future supply. So high prices alone do not prove Trump is lying about American production. But neither does American production prove that the Strait of Hormuz is secure. Those are different claims. That distinction matters because political messaging frequently bundles several partially related facts together. If domestic production is high, that becomes evidence that energy policy is working. If oil has not reached an extreme hypothetical price, that becomes evidence that the geopolitical strategy is working. If some ships pass through a contested waterway, that becomes evidence of complete control. Each step sounds plausible when delivered quickly. Each step needs its own evidence. This is where viewers should resist the temptation to choose between believing everything and believing nothing. The better question is, which individual claim survives when we isolate it? Take the Strait of Hormuz. Some ships are passing is not equivalent to complete control. Take American production. The United States produces substantial oil is not equivalent to global energy disruption no longer matters. Take fuel prices. Prices are high is not by itself proof that one president caused the entire increase. Political accountability becomes much easier to manipulate when those distinctions disappear. And this leads directly into another foreign policy claim in Trump's remarks. He says he expects to meet North Korean leader Kim Jong un later in the year. The source contrasts that with comments attributed to Kim Yo Jong, Kim Jong un's sister, saying she was unaware of recent communication and indicating that changes to United States South Korea military exercises would not fundamentally alter North Korea's strategic position. The supplied material does not give us the complete statement, diplomatic correspondence, or independent confirmation of either side's private contacts. So, we cannot conclude from this record alone that a meeting is impossible or that Trump fabricated communications. Presidents can pursue meetings before every detail is publicly acknowledged. Governments also routinely communicate through intermediaries. That is the strongest reasonable defense. But here is the accountability test. When a president publicly creates an expectation about diplomacy with a nuclear armed state, how much corroboration should the public demand before treating that expectation as an actual diplomatic breakthrough? A planned meeting, an invitation, a private contact, and a president saying he expects to meet someone are four different things. Conflating them can manufacture the appearance of progress before progress exists. The source also says Trump criticized United States military exercises with South Korea as hostile or destabilizing. That matters because South Korea is an American ally, while North Korea has built nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capabilities in direct opposition to the security architecture Washington has maintained in the region. Again, presidents are allowed to reconsider military exercises. Reducing or restructuring exercises can be part of diplomacy. There is nothing inherently illegitimate about changing policy. The question is what America receives in return. If Washington reduces activity while Pyongyang continues expanding its strategic capabilities, the administration must explain why the concession improves American or allied security. If North Korea makes reciprocal changes, that changes the calculation. That is how foreign policy should be evaluated, not by whether the gesture sounds peaceful or tough, but by measurable results. Now put these pieces together. At the White House, Trump describes a ballroom as part of a military complex involving drones and bomb shelters. On Iran, he describes conditions as so good and claims complete control of a strategically vital waterway. On North Korea, he projects confidence about a future meeting even as the source material presents a conflicting signal from Pyongyang. Across all three subjects, the recurring issue is certainty. The language is bigger than the evidence presented alongside it. That does not automatically make every statement false, but it makes verification more important. And then the story shifts back to the ballroom, where Trump compares it favorably with a grand room he saw in China, saying the American project will surpass anything else in the world. Normally, presidential boasting about architecture would be mostly political theater, but the context changes its meaning, because this is not being described merely as a beautiful event space. Trump himself has attached military functions to it, and according to the source, its construction is facing a constitutional and legal dispute involving authority over public property and congressional power. That creates a basic democratic question. Does the grandeur of a project make procedural constraints less important or more important? The answer should not depend on whether you like the president proposing it. If Congress has authority that applies here, a popular president should have to respect it. A non popular president should have to respect it. A Republican should, a Democrat should. That is the point of institutional rules. They are most valuable when political enthusiasm makes people want exceptions. There is another major allegation in the source material involving Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and government debt operations. The commentator describes expanded Treasury buybacks of longer dated securities and characterizes the policy as a kind of financial engineering intended to push down long term yields. But this is one place where the source goes much further than the evidence it actually provides. It calls the maneuver a Ponzi scheme. That is a serious accusation. The material does describe a mechanism, issuing or relying more heavily on shorter term debt while increasing buybacks of longer dated securities, with the argument that reducing the supply of those securities could influence longer term yields. But calling that a Ponzi scheme requires much more than demonstrating debt management or market intervention. A Ponzi scheme has a specific meaning involving fraudulent returns financed by money from later participants, rather than legitimate underlying gains. Nothing in the supplied material establishes that definition. So, the allegation should not be repeated as fact. There can still be legitimate criticism. Shifting that towards shorter maturities can expose the government to refinancing risk. Attempts to influence the maturity structure of federal debt can have consequences for interest costs. And if officials are deliberately trying to affect borrowing conditions before an election, the political incentives deserve scrutiny. But those are arguments to investigate, not permission to use the most inflammatory label available. This is an important moment because skepticism has to work in both directions. If we demand evidence when Trump says America has complete control of a strategic waterway, we also have to demand evidence when a Trump critic calls Treasury operations a Ponzi scheme. Otherwise, we are not practicing an evidentiary standard. We are practicing team loyalty. And if the political identities were reversed, would your definition of acceptable evidence suddenly change? That question is uncomfortable because it exposes one of the easiest ways political audiences get manipulated. People often demand courtroom level proof from opponents and accept a viral clip from allies. The result is not merely misinformation, it is vulnerability. Once someone knows which conclusion you want, they know what evidence you are least likely to inspect. That is why the most consequential part of this entire episode may not be any single bizarre phrase about grass, stone, drones, or ballrooms. It is the collision of spectacle and government power. The spectacle attracts attention. The underlying institutional questions receive less of it. A president talking about grass being happy is funny enough to dominate clips. A president saying a ballroom has become part of a military complex raises a harder question about authorization. A boast about having the greatest ballroom in the world is easy to mock. A dispute over who has constitutional authority over White House property requires reading legal arguments. A sweeping declaration of complete control over the Strait of Hormuz sounds decisive. Determining whether that statement is operationally accurate requires shipping data, military information, and evidence about actual commercial risk. The political advantage of spectacle is that it can crowd out verification, and that is why ordinary people pay the price when public debate becomes a contest over the most entertaining clip. Government decisions continue, whether or not the public conversation reaches the underlying facts. Military deployments continue. Debt has to be financed. Energy markets respond to risk. Alliances respond to American decisions. Public property remains governed by law. The real standard should therefore be much simpler than the partisan argument surrounding Trump. When the president makes a measurable claim, measure it. When he claims legal authority, identify the authority. When critics allege misconduct, demand the evidence. When a company with a political relationship provides something to the government, disclose the arrangement and apply the ethics rules. When a ceremonial project acquires a military purpose, explain who approved the military purpose. And when officials use absolute language like complete control, the evidence should be strong enough to justify the word complete. Based only on the record presented here, we cannot responsibly conclude that every accusation made against Trump in the source is established. Several claims are interpretations. Some require independent records that are not provided. The Treasury Ponzi scheme characterization, for example, is not demonstrated by the evidence supplied. The exact operational condition of the Strait of Hormuz is also not established by this material alone. But Trump's own quoted remarks create legitimate questions that do not disappear simply because some criticism around them is overheated. He publicly described the ballroom as having a military component. He publicly talked about drones and bomb shelters in connection with that project. He publicly acknowledged that Scott's Miracle Grow had contributed to his campaign while thanking the company for providing White House grass free of charge. He publicly described the situation involving Iran as very good. He publicly claimed complete control of the Strait of Hormuz, and he publicly expressed confidence about meeting Kim Jong un. Those statements can be tested. That is the key. The strongest criticism of political power is not an insult, it is a claim that survives verification. And the strongest defense of a president is not loyalty, it is evidence showing that the president's claims match reality. The ballroom controversy, therefore, matters beyond whether you think the project is impressive, excessive, useful, or absurd. It asks a much older question about democratic government. When one person holds enormous power, what prevents personal preference from becoming public policy without sufficient scrutiny? The answer is supposed to be institutions, Congress, courts, disclosure rules, independent reporting, public records, and ultimately a citizenry willing to apply the same evidentiary standard to leaders it likes and leaders it hates. The next political clip will probably ask for your certainty before you have the complete record. Without a method, someone else gets to choose the framing, hide the missing context, and borrow your conviction for political advantage. Become the person who checks the decisive evidence first. Don't Get Played is the practical method for doing that. The digital ebook costs only $9, one time. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. A political reaction is easy. A defensible conclusion has to survive the evidence.